You can be in a relationship and still lose track of your own value inside it, not because you're weak, but because emotional dependence quietly changes the way your mind prices affection, attention, and approval. That's what this video explains. How emotional dependence doesn't just make you need someone more, it distorts your internal valuation system. How you estimate what you deserve, what the other person is worth, what a relationship costs, and what you'll tolerate to keep it. Most people think value in relationships is something you discover. Like you observe behavior, you make a judgment, and you decide, this is good for me or it isn't. But emotional dependence reverses the direction. Instead of value being the conclusion, value becomes the strategy. And when value becomes a strategy, your perception stops being neutral. It becomes motivated, it becomes defensive, it becomes selective. Pause for a second and notice how subtle that is. A motivated mind doesn't ask, what is this relationship giving me? It asks, what interpretation helps me keep this bond intact? That's the distortion. And it matters because once your valuation system is distorted, you can't negotiate well, you can't set boundaries cleanly, and you can't even trust your own conclusions, because your conclusions are now serving attachment security, not truth. Let's define emotional dependence carefully, because it's easy to confuse it with closeness. Emotional dependence is not simply loving someone intensely. It's an extreme emotional need for the bond to remain stable, paired with patterns like fear of abandonment, possessiveness, difficulty breaking ties, and a reliance on the relationship to regulate internal states like anxiety, emptiness, or self-worth. That definition already hints at the core mechanism. When your emotional equilibrium depends on another person, the relationship stops being a connection and starts functioning like an emotional infrastructure. And infrastructure is hard to replace. If the bridge is unstable, you don't calmly evaluate it. You panic because you still need to cross. So the mind starts doing what minds do under dependency. It reduces uncertainty by changing perception. Not consciously, not with evil intent, but predictably. Now here's the key idea. Emotional dependence distorts your sense of value through three interacting systems. One is relational value tracking, your brain's constant scanning of where you stand in the other person's eyes. Second is emotional regulation dependence, the degree to which the other person becomes your primary tool for calming down, feeling okay, and returning to baseline. Third is cognitive distortion under threat. When attachment is threatened, your mind shifts standards, interpretations, and memories in ways that protect the bond. Let's unpack each. First, relational value tracking. There's a reason a single unread message can feel like a referendum on your worth. In attachment anxiety, concerns about being valued are not a background worry. They become a lens through which interactions are interpreted. Research on attachment anxiety shows that when people feel less valued and appreciated, it can shape their behavior during stressful moments in the relationship, sometimes leading to more negative reactions instead of supportive ones, which then harms relationship quality over time. Notice what that implies. If your sense of being valued is unstable, you will monitor cues more intensely. You'll treat small signals as meaningful. And when you do that, your internal price for validation goes up. A normal relationship dynamic becomes a market where reassurance is scarce, so it becomes expensive. So you pay. You pay with silence. You pay with over-accommodation. You pay with over-explaining. You pay by shrinking your needs until they're easier to accept. That's not a moral failure. That's a valuation distortion driven by scarcity. And scarcity always inflates perceived value. If you've ever felt like attention from this one person is worth more than attention from anyone else, you've already tasted the distortion, because the attention isn't objectively rare. What's rare is the specific reassurance that calms your particular fear. Second, emotional regulation dependence. This is where things become even more confusing, because dependence can temporarily improve how you see the partner. A 2025 paper described emotion regulation dependence as relying on interactions with your romantic partner to regulate emotion, and found that this kind of dependence can motivate people to see the partner as more supportive and evaluate their traits more positively. Read that again, because it's counterintuitive. Depending on a partner to regulate emotions can make the partner look better, not necessarily because the partner is better, but because your mind benefits from believing they are. If your nervous system uses them as a stabilizer, then downgrading them psychologically becomes risky. It would mean admitting, "My stabilizer is unreliable." That's a hard truth to hold. So the mind often does something simpler. It upgrades the stabilizer. It tells you, "They're special. They're the only one who understands me." It's complicated, but deep down, they care. Those statements might be true, or they might be the mind protecting its regulatory dependency. And here's where your sense of value really warps. The partner's value becomes fused with your emotional survival. That fusion changes how you read evidence. You notice their good moments. You explain away their bad ones. You interpret inconsistency as complexity rather than unreliability. And you don't do that because you're irrational. You do it because the cost of seeing reality clearly feels too high. Third, cognitive distortion under threat. When the bond feels threatened, the mind doesn't simply assess. It bargains with itself. You may have noticed this pattern. Your standards become flexible only in one direction. If something good happens, it proves the relationship is real. If something bad happens, it's an exception, a misunderstanding, a temporary phase. That asymmetry is not random. It's protective, and it creates a specific distortion. You start valuing the relationship not by its average quality, but by its peak moments. The mind begins to anchor on rare highs, a powerful apology, a sudden affectionate week, an intense reconnection after distance. Those moments can become the proof you use to justify the entire pattern. So your valuation is no longer based on stability. It's based on intermittency, and intermittency is one of the most potent reinforcement schedules in human learning. When rewards are unpredictable, the brain works harder, it stays vigilant, it keeps trying, it invests more. This is why emotional dependence can create a strange experience. The relationship may feel more valuable as it becomes less secure. Because insecurity increases chasing, and chasing increases investment, and investment increases perceived value. Let's slow down here, because this is one of the most important micro-turns in the whole concept. When you invest heavily in something, your mind is pressured to justify the investment. Otherwise, you face cognitive dissonance. Why am I doing so much for something that isn't good for me? So the mind resolves the tension by inflating value. It must be worth it. This must be love. This must be meaningful. That's not romance. That's psychological accounting. Now let's bring these three systems together into a simple mechanism. Emotional dependence increases the need for attachment security. That need increases relational monitoring and emotional regulation reliance. Those pressures distort perception, memory, and standards, so you can keep the bond and reduce internal distress. And that distortion changes your sense of value in 4 predictable ways. 1. You undervalue your own worth. 2. You overvalue the partner's approval. 3. You misprice the costs you're paying. 4. You treat leaving as a catastrophic loss rather than a rational trade-off. Let's go one by one. Undervaluing your own worth usually doesn't feel like, "I hate myself." It's more subtle. It feels like your needs are negotiable, but theirs are not. It feels like you should be easy to love, meaning low maintenance, meaning minimal. It feels like you have to earn basic kindness. And once that's your internal model, your self-valuation becomes performance-based. Your worth is no longer intrinsic. It becomes conditional on how well you keep the other person close. Overvaluing the partner's approval is the next distortion. Approval starts to function like currency, not because approval is inherently bad, but because your mind treats it as the most reliable signal that you're safe in the relationship. Research on attachment anxiety highlights how feeling unvalued and unappreciated is central in shaping reactions and behaviors in relationship contexts, especially under stress. So you start making decisions not based on what's correct, but on what will produce appreciation. This is how you end up with a relationship that's peaceful only when you're compliant. And then there's mispricing the costs. In emotionally dependent dynamics, costs get normalized. You might accept chronic uncertainty. You might accept emotional whiplash. You might accept that you have to manage the relationship's emotional climate alone. You might accept controlling behavior as care. And you don't label these as costs, because labeling them as costs would pressure you to reconsider the bond. So instead, your mind labels them as what love requires. But love is not supposed to require self-erasure. Finally, the catastrophic model of leaving. Emotional dependence makes leaving feel less like ending a relationship and more like losing oxygen. Because the relationship has become a regulator, it has become a stabilizer. And when a stabilizer is removed, your mind predicts collapse. This is one reason emotionally dependent patterns are often associated with difficulty breaking ties and fear of abandonment. Now, I want to make an important clarification because it protects the concept from becoming simplistic. Dependence is not identical to interdependence. Healthy relationships also involve emotional linkage. Partners influence each other's mood over time, and emotional interdependence can be associated with well-being in certain forms. The problem is not that you're affected by someone. The problem is when your valuation system becomes captured by the fear of losing them. That's the difference between my partner matters to me and my partner defines whether I'm okay. Now let's do a short illustrative example. Not a story, just a clean mechanism demonstration. Imagine two people receive the same behavior. Their partner cancels plans last minute, offers a vague excuse, and doesn't reschedule. A non-dependent valuation system might register it as a cost, unreliability, low investment, weak consideration. A dependent valuation system is more likely to perform a protective reinterpretation. They're overwhelmed. I shouldn't be demanding. If I push, I'll seem needy. It's not a big deal. Same data, different pricing. And here's the twist. The dependent mind might increase its investment after the cancellation. More affection, more availability, more being understanding. Because the cancellation triggered threat, and the response to threat is to secure the bond. So the person starts paying more for less. That's the distortion in one sentence. Let's expand the analysis, because these distortions have social and interpersonal consequences. When emotional dependence distorts value, it changes what you reinforce in the other person. If you reward distance with pursuit, you teach distance. If you reward inconsistency with extra care, you stabilize inconsistency. If you reward minimal effort with gratitude, you set the market price low. This is not about blaming the dependent person. It's about revealing the feedback loop. Relationships are systems, and systems respond to reinforcement. This is also why emotionally dependent dynamics can pair with asymmetry. One person becomes the regulator seeker, the other becomes the regulator source. And that role division can invite power imbalance. In fact, research on emotional dependence in couples describes it as a relational disorder marked by role asymmetry and dependent attitudes, and it notes associations with controlling, restrictive, and sometimes aggressive behaviors aimed at limiting a partner's autonomy. That's a critical nuance. Dependence is not always passive. Sometimes it drives control, because if your emotional stability depends on the other person, then their autonomy can feel like danger. So controlling behavior can appear, not from cruelty, but from the perceived need to reduce uncertainty. And on the other side of the system, Certain partner traits can amplify the distortion. A 2024 study found that participants with emotional dependence reported higher narcissistic traits in their partners on average than those without emotional dependence. And it also found a positive correlation between partner narcissism and psychological abuse. You don't need to interpret that as dependent people always choose bad partners. That would be too simple. But the study supports a structural idea. When one person is highly dependent and the other has traits that benefit from being idealized and accommodated, the distortion can intensify. In those dynamics, the dependent person's valuation system becomes even more unstable because approval becomes intermittent and conditional, exactly the kind of pattern that triggers more chasing, more investment, and more self-undervaluation. Now, let's widen the lens. What are the broader theoretical implications? One implication is that value in relationships is not a fixed trait of a person or a bond. It's a perception shaped by motivational states. When the motivational state is security-seeking, you evaluate through the question, will this keep the bond? When the motivational state is self-respect, you evaluate through the question, does this pattern align with my standards? When the motivational state is fear, you evaluate through the question, what can I tolerate to avoid loss? So a distorted valuation system isn't just mistaken, it's purpose-built. It is optimized for short-term attachment stability, even if it creates long-term harm. Another implication is that emotional dependence can create paradoxical feelings of clarity inside dysfunction. You may feel certain that this person is irreplaceable. You may feel certain that your needs are too much. You may feel certain that the relationship is deep because it feels intense. But intensity is not the same thing as value. Intensity can be produced by uncertainty, by intermittent reassurance, and by the constant mental work of monitoring relational cues. A calm bond can feel boring to a nervous system trained to equate love with activation, and that leads to a final distortion. You start confusing regulation with connection. If someone calms your anxiety, you might call it love. If someone triggers your anxiety and then relieves it, you might call it passion. If someone keeps you uncertain, you might call it chemistry. But chemistry can be a stress response wearing a romantic label. So what does this explain in practical terms? It explains why people can stay in relationships that don't meet their standards, while sincerely believing the relationship is uniquely valuable. It explains why reassurance can feel addictive. It explains why leaving can feel like losing yourself. And it explains why, after the relationship ends, people often look back and think, I don't recognize what I tolerated. Because the valuation system resets when the dependency loosens, the market changes, the currency changes, and suddenly the price you were paying looks irrational. But it wasn't irrational in the moment. It was adaptive to the perceived threat. That's the final conceptual synthesis. Emotional dependence doesn't just make you want someone. It makes your mind treat the bond as necessary for internal stability. And when something is necessary, your brain stops valuing it accurately. It values it defensively. That is how emotional dependence distorts your sense of value in relationships. If this video helped you see the mechanism, not just the emotion, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel, because this is what we do. We break down human behavior into clear, usable models you can recognize in real time. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next analysis, and if you want to support the kind of psychology content that stays rigorous instead of dramatic, hit like. It tells the algorithm this is worth recommending. And leave a comment with one sentence. What did this explain for you? Not a story, just the pattern you recognized. That's how you turn insight into skill.